Hope everybody's enjoying their lunch. I think we'll just get started if we can. I'm Daniel Greenberg. I'm the General Counsel of SAP Canada, and I'm a board member of the Ontario chapter of the ACC. Welcome here to Goodman's, and we're going to have a great session today on cybersecurity essentials for in-house counsel. Thanks to our sponsor, Goodman's, and we are grateful for them setting up this event. The event will be recorded and available for rebroadcast on the ACC website. I had the benefit of actually being asked to participate in the panel over my objections. I've had the benefit of looking at the materials, and today especially, it is an incredibly topical day to have this discussion and to bring all of these issues to the fore and look at those issues in respect of in-house counsel, which we all are part of that area. You know, we look at these issues from outside and from inside counsel's perspective, but we're the people as inside counsel that deal with these issues on a more regular basis and have to deal with the consequences of the actions of our companies. For those not familiar with the ACC, it is a global bar association that promotes professionalism and business interests of in-house counsel. It has representation in more than 85 countries and has more than 40,000 members. In Ontario chapter, this is our chapter here, we have 800 members. We would greatly appreciate more members, and if anybody would like to join, we have that ability at any time. They can access the website and look for more information about joining the ACC. I am on the board as the membership committee chair and would encourage you to join, and if not, I will be in contact with you probably to encourage you to join. Can tell you about other benefits of the ACC, including the materials and our website and all kinds of different available materials for you to review and to use in your practice. But personally, my biggest benefit of being an ACC member is the collegial environment that we interact with other members of this bar and other general counsels and other counsel, in-house counsel. It's an incredible benefit to have that connection when you're doing transactions and conducting your business around the city of Toronto and around Ontario, to have these personal contacts that are developed throughout this organization. So without further ado, unless Alan has any other things that he wants me to speak to, I will introduce our panel today that will discuss these issues. Peter Ruby is a partner at the firm of Goodman's. These will be very short introductions, and then people can say more about what they do, and you will hear about what they do. Jennifer Drake is with Aon Canada in the risk group and vice president of legal and a legal consultant in the financial services group. Joseph Knizer, I hope I got that right. We've had to practice, is the founder of Jolera. Victor Liu is also at Goodman's, and he is a partner, and his practice focuses on mergers and acquisitions and corporate finance, with an area of expertise that we're developing today and going to discuss. We're looking forward to hearing lots from Victor today. So I'll save my closing remarks for the closing, and I think we'll hand it over to Peter to get started with the substantive nature of the comments.
Thank you. So I don't know if this is substantive, but let's start with first looking at one of the examples of what we're facing in terms of breaches.
So I invited a few of the world's best hackers to try to hack me and show me where my vulnerabilities are. And now I'm going to meet them in Las Vegas for DEF CON, the biggest hacker convention of the year. They're going to hack me using social engineering, which is essentially hacking without any code. They just use a phone and an internet connection.
Do you want to do a sample phishing call?
What's phishing?
Phishing is voice solicitation, and basically what you do is you use the phone to extract information or data points that can be used in a later attack.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Who are you going to call?
Maybe I'll call your cell phone provider and see if I can get them to give me your email address.
I bet they're good. I bet they have my back. But yeah, go for it.
I'm going to spoof from your number, so it's going to look like it's calling from you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm so sorry. Can you hear me okay? My baby, I'm sorry. my husband's like, we're about to apply for a loan and we just had a baby and he's like, get this done by today. So I'm so sorry. I can't call you back. I'm trying to log into our account for uses information, and I can't remember what email address we used to log the account. The baby's crying, and can you help me? Awesome.
In just 30 seconds,
At gmail.com.
Jessica gets access to my personal email address.
Now, if I needed to add our older daughter on our account so she could call in and make changes, how would I need to go about doing that? You would have to send me a secure PIN through a text message? Yeah, well, the thing is, I don't think I'll be able to receive a text message if I'm on the phone. Shh. Oh, I'm not on there either? So I thought when we got married, he added me to the account.
Jess uses my girlfriend's name and a fake social security number
5127.
to set up her own personal access to my account.
Wait, I'm sorry, so there's no password on my account right now? Can I set that up?
She even gets the support person to change my password.
Thank you so much for your help today.
So she just basically blocked me out of my own account.
I'll get her fed after this. All right, thank you.
Holy shit. So they just gave you access to my entire cell phone account.
You're gonna have to go on and change your password now because it's Jess, my name.
And all it took was a crying baby and a phone call.
Yeah.
There's one of many examples of how this happens. And what we're going to talk about today, we're going to try and really have our conversation with three goals. The first is to look at breaches not from a crisis management point of view, but from the point of view of what we can do to learn from those breaches about how to improve our security, improve our practices, and improve the advice that is counsel that we're giving the business folks about what they should be doing. We're also going to try and put in context the laws and some of the other things we're going to talk about. And then finally, we're going to think about how to answer some of the questions that we find are fairly typical from senior management and boards about cybersecurity and cyber breaches. But before we do that, I just want to tell you about a breach that we were involved in. And I should say I'm a litigator that spends almost all my time doing technology-related disputes and problems, which increasingly is dealing with cyber breaches. So nobody ever calls me when things are going well, only when it's going badly. And I want to tell you about something that happened this past Labor Day weekend. So the Friday before Labor Day weekend, I was hiking in Iceland with my family, and I got when there's one bar of service and you make the mistake of picking up your phone and looking, and it said, an email from the client, the general counsel, saying, urgent, can you call me? We've had a breach. And I'd like to read you part of the email they got from the hacker earlier that day. So it starts with, believe it or not, hello, and names the company. I'm obviously not going to give you that information. And it says, you have 36 hours to make a decision that can change the future of your company and the lives of millions of your users. And by the way, the company is a large public company that if I told you the name, all of you would know who it is. You were careless and reckless with their data, and now it's time to remedy the situation. And they go on to say that we have over 1 million user accounts with their passwords stored in either plain text or MD5, along with a treasure trove of information, including mother's maiden name, address, IP address, email address, and the list goes on. In addition, they have 1 million full profiles and another 200,000 accounts from another database. And they also say, all in all, we recovered about 2 million complete user profiles from your unprotected database server. We were also able to recover a number of your employee emails. Then comes the good part. It says, okay, this isn't my words, okay, so enough small chat. We have been offered in the mid 5 figures for this information. However, we had hoped to be able to reach an understanding with your company and return all the data to you, preventing your company from a very embarrassing and costly publicity nightmare. Then they explain what they want, and what they want is $57,600, which they figure out. They say our rates are $80 to $175 an hour at so many hours and so many people. They calculated $57,000. And they say compare that to the $7 million most data breaches currently cost companies, and you're saving quite a bit of money, exclamation mark. Okay? You have 36 hours to send $56,600 worth of Bitcoin to the following address. You're welcome to contact us. But this process is automated 36 hours from now. If exactly 12.2 Bitcoin has not been confirmed to the address above, your data will be sold to the current highest offer. And then they go and threaten that we're going to report you to government authorities and news outlets. So that is a real life example of a serious breach experienced by a Canadian company, which the general counsel had to handle over the Labor Day weekend. And I can tell you, not quite by Labor Day, but by the Tuesday after Labor Day, this all had to be done because, of course, although the hacker extended the deadline, it only lasted several days, and it was more or less over. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do is go through with our very impressive panel some questions. And the first one, I think for context, really is, we all know, because we see the news, that there have been an accelerating number of breaches we've been seeing in the business, not just in Canada, but around the world. Joe, maybe you can start by helping us understand why we might be seeing so many breaches.
I think, thanks, Peter. So for many reasons, I think looking at when you sum it all up, it really comes down to a couple items, but mostly a lot of the attacks these days are being driven by financial gain. There's huge financial benefit, and from that financial benefit and gain has developed this really sophisticated architecture of bounties and sale of data. So what we're seeing in the marketplace today, and we'll talk about what the marketplace is in a second, in the next slide you can look at it, but what we're seeing in the marketplace today is there's groups of organized individuals that are working either alone or in unison. Some of them are doing reconnaissance, some are doing the data collection, some are targeting organizations and users, and sometimes the original reconnaissance or surveyor of data isn't the actual assailant that ends up with the piece that they use against you to gain financial gain. And because of that, it's a really sophisticated large network. And that network is being powered by untraceable currency. So untraceable currency, like Bitcoin or others, have allowed the financial benefits of these assailants, we call them, to further essentially target someone like your client and really essentially get away with it. So we're seeing that. And the piece that really interests me the most is this deep dark web kind of concept. The screenshot you see here is a piece of that, and that gives you, when you have something of value, and something that seems to be of great value these days to hackers and bounties, is passwords. So passwords, believe it or not, are some of the most valuable hacking commodities that exist on the marketplace. And the reason they're so powerful is because technology and systems have gotten really good at, thwarting attacks or stopping attacks or detecting attacks. But if it's an accepted user by a guest password, the system is that much more open to talking to you. So in this situation here, we just threw a screenshot up of someone selling passwords for a movie. So I have a passwords list that would be of value. I post it for sale, and I get credits, and in return for that, I want to download a movie that was recently released. And that's happening all across the board. Let's say I profile an organization. I collect profile data about that organization. I know the C-level execs. I know some of the board members. And I also, what do you know, I have some of the leaked LinkedIn hack passwords from those execs. So I can package that for sale. And so I'm a reconnaissance person putting that up for sale, and then the more sophisticated specialized intruders, similar to the one that you dealt with, they will take that data and then they will start to specialize and try and penetrate the environment. So if you go to the next picture, that will show, they talk about hard to catch. So the web that some of us live in is this surface web, which is the high level web. That's Google, Facebook, everything today, email, transit, that's all stuff that you can see, feel, touch. We can decrypt some of it. We can look into some of it. Then there's this deeper web that is kind of second layer where some of these transactions are happening. And then there's the dark web, the dark net. So this is what I want to throw your attention to is that the larger data throughput of the internet is not the live web that we all kind of transverse and live with. It's the deep and dark web, and those are kind of the untraceable areas where a lot of these transactions and bounties and datas and attacks are originating from. They're coming from there. And so, it creates a bit of a nightmare for authorities and for assailants and for everybody else. We have to be ready for that. So that's what I think is happening today.
Terrific. Maybe we can talk a little bit about on the corporate side, as opposed to, government intrusions. Some examples, or what are the kinds of significant breaches that are being seen? And Jen, since you're in-house at an insurance broker, you're in a good position maybe to help us with that.
Sure, absolutely. So the examples I'd like to talk about today are examples that have happened to organizations who actually had purchased cyber insurance. So these come from claims that they made through insurance companies. But before I actually get into the claims, I wanted to talk a little bit about the next slide, because it really plays into exactly what you just heard from Peter and Joseph, is that this data comes from cyber insurance claims reported across the US and Canada. And what it shows us is that, along the lines of what Joseph is saying, the majority of the primary causes of privacy breaches are coming from hackers and malware, which are, as Joseph said, very difficult for organizations to control. And then the next highest cause is that human element. So lost or stolen laptops, the rogue employee, or a staff mistake, which actually, when you add that up, leads to about 30% of the cause of privacy breaches. So when we talk about what kind of claims are we seeing, I have two brief examples that I'd like to give to you. The first relates to a network interruption that we saw a client experience. In this case, the hackers gained access to the organization's system through a targeted spear phishing attack. So they actually researched an individual at the company, realized through that individual's social media posts that they were a member of an extracurricular organization, and they spoofed an email from that organization. It looked incredibly realistic. It was consistent with the organization's branding, it was consistent with their geographic location, and it was consistent with that organization's regular messaging. So, of course, that individual clicked on the link, allowing the hackers to then place ransomware in the computers, and they actually were able to shut down 7 servers and hundreds of personal computers. They demanded 12 Bitcoin as a ransom, probably in a message somewhat similar to what Peter saw. So at that point, the organization, as one of the first things that they did, is they did engage their insurance company, and they reached out through a 1-800 hotline number to get access to a breach coach, brought in forensic IT specialists. The IT forensics actually could not unencrypt the data without the code, so the decision was made that they should pay the ransom. And so once they had that key, they were able to slowly bring their systems back online, but their networks were down for a total of 2.5 days. And this is, as you'll see compared to my next example, a good case scenario. They were able to engage experts early and quickly to help to mitigate the potential damages. And at the end of that, it still resulted in almost over $3 million in total damages when you looked at the cost to procure the Bitcoin, the legal counsel. They paid $950,000 in forensic investigation, $65,000 in legal, $1.1 million for lost income, and $850,000 for additional expenses associated with the outage. That was over 2.5 days. So luckily for them, they were able to get insurance to pay for most of that, but not a small number for what seems like a small, initially maybe a small situation. My next example is very similar, but in this case, it didn't go quite as smoothly. So it wasn't a targeted attack. It was a random ransomware attack on the organization. The attackers used scanning tools to scan the internet to detect any organization that had a vulnerability. Once they found this vulnerability, they exploited it to download malware, ransomware onto the system, and again, shutting down multiple servers and multiple computers. In this case, individuals at the organization reached out to IT forensic specialists to get them engaged, but prior to doing that, they took it upon themselves to engage directly with the hackers. So they sent an email from their own company's email address. They made statements such as, "We cannot function, our business operations are down," and they actually told the attackers the extent to which the malware had been successful in their system. But then they advised them, "We're going to engage outside help, so we're bringing in someone to help us." So at this point, they've told their attackers what organization they've actually hit, which, depending on the malware variant being used, they may not have actually known because it is random. They've indicated that they're desperate, that the attack has been successful and they're actually not operating. And they've also indicated that they have money to go outside and retain someone to help them. Another important point to this example is that the attackers hadn't made a ransomware demand up front. So following that communication, they finally made their demand, and it was only $300,000 US worth of Bitcoin. So the forensic specialists came in, and they actually were unable to unencrypt, and the decision was made to pay. In the meantime, the attackers actually increased the ransom because they said, "You're talking too much, and you're taking too long to pay." They ultimately negotiated down to about $270,000 US, and they were patting themselves on the back for that one. And at that point, that's when they contacted their insurance company to say, "By the way, we have incurred all of these forensic specialist costs, and we need $270,000 US in Bitcoin ASAP." So there's a saying that it is better to beg for forgiveness than to ask for permission. And I will tell you right now, when it comes to an insurance policy, that is not the best way to proceed, okay? Insurance companies, they are exactly like my partner. They do not like it when you incur costs on their behalf and then go to them to seek reimbursement. It does not work well. Most policies require the insurance company to consent to the way you're going to proceed and the costs that you're going to incur. So in this case, it's still outstanding as to how much the insurance policy will actually pay out of those costs. But you can imagine they're going to be very similar to the costs incurred in the first example, if not worse. And it's going to be a question of a negotiation process in terms of how much will ultimately be paid.
So those are some good examples, but one of the reasons we thought it was valuable to have Joseph with us is because he deals with this on the technical side. So can you walk us through a little bit about, we heard about spear phishing. Like, how does a hack happen?
There is so when I look at hacks, I look at maybe 4 different types and categories. And maybe I can give you some the different categories, and then I'll try and give you a small example of each. So the one hack that from spear phishing is when you send a targeted email to one or a group of individuals to try and collect credential data from them from a body that they would normally get information from. So in this, one of the best spear phishing campaigns I've ever seen is one that they used the Apple, the iTunes store. That was incredible. They were sending spear phishing emails, and the reason I said it was so good is because the request was very simple. It was, if you haven't transacted this item on your iTunes account, then you should click here and remedy it. And I guess you're saying, I didn't buy that for $30, and the immediate reaction is like, I'm going to click on that, and what it asks you for immediately is your iTunes credentials. And it's a perfect, the way they had created the email and the login screen, someone took a lot of time to really paint it perfectly. So from there, that is essentially spear phishing. And what ends up happening with spear phishing attack, it's not the spear phish itself or the credentials that are the problem. The problem is once you've given them the credentials, they can use those credentials to install something on your computer. If you have the right permissions, and we'll get to that later. But if you have the right permissions, now they've installed something on your computer. And now they're inside your computer, and they have a little, we call it a payload. I'm just going to call it a little spy to simplify it. But they have this spy inside your system, and they now can scan inside your environment to collect data around your servers, your history, how you're working. They can even, there's some payloads that are more sophisticated. There's some payloads that they used to use in the old days that could see your screen. And that leads me to, the latest breach that we worked with was a corporate espionage breach where someone actually stole all the signing authority information, signatures, PO, requisition forms. They took all this data that would allow you to essentially set up the same company somewhere else, and they changed one letter in the domain and all the email addresses, but all the logos and all the information were the same. And they had all the vendor information. They started placing big orders for electronic equipment with the vendors of the client. And they did one thing. They changed the delivery and shipping addresses for the delivery of this equipment. And so the vendors received the orders, looked kind of close, looked like the same PO. It's a couple of things might be different, but the signing authority was there, the signature was there, everything. And they were placing orders of 30 to 40,000. They did 3 transactions, all shipped, in one shipped to the province of Ontario, another one to Quebec, etc. With, and what ends up happening in that situation is equipment goes, someone comes, picks it up, no one can track who they are. It's not like they're taking a photocopy of the driver's license, and when you call authorities, they're like, get in line kind of thing. So that's the corporate espionage side of what data theft. Another one that was mentioned earlier was the denial of service. That is someone sending a lot of data to your network and basically essentially stopping you from doing business. So they overload and overwhelm your systems. That is more of a very targeted attack. Where they kind of overload your systems. There's nothing you really can do. You can't really send an email anymore. Your website doesn't work anymore, and you need to work on that one. The other 2 types are one is data theft that you talked about before, and the other one is what I refer to as reconnaissance. This is where they're just stealing stuff from you to use for somewhere else. They're not really going to hurt you with it. They maybe steal some password data, but inside their environment they couldn't find any user records. They really couldn't find anything of value. And believe it or not, for us, a lot of the times, I call them assailants. That's the name. When I speak to them, I call them an assailant. A lot of the times is they don't know what they've stumbled on. They get data and they're like, what is this? What is these records? And so sometimes we're seeing people download data or some data download, but they didn't really know how valuable it was. They maybe went after an old copy that wasn't as valuable, but still important. So maybe that gives you an understanding of the different types of breaches and attacks that are happening.
Sure. Why don't we show just a piece of this little video that illustrates it.
How did you decide to become a hacker?
Well, I'm not really sure what it means to become a hacker. That's like some guy in a hoodie who types really fast and stays up all night writing code and cracking passwords. It's not me. I just spy on people and see what makes them click. It's not a bad job.
Mark Hanning, CEO of Qualicart, set to report earnings after their blockbuster IPO.
So you consider this a job?
I put a lot of work into this. I'm not lazy. It takes research to figure out the key players, learn all about them, their families, their friends, what they care about. You have to understand the company's organization. I get a lot of my information from the sales department because they're always so quick and eager. They're hungry. People trust too easily. They don't look at the details. I do. Details matter. That's what I'm good at. It has to look completely believable. It has to look
Really 2 things. One, here's somebody who's describing hacking as their job, and they're very proud of themselves. They put a lot of work into it, and they really focus on it. The second is on, when we think of hacking, we often think of it as just a technological exercise. Sometimes it is, but very often it's actually a human exercise. It's looking at people as a vulnerability to attack, which obviously has implications when you're advising your clients on what to do to make your system more secure. It's not just about spending more money on technology. It's about spending money on training, and the right training as well on people. So let's turn now from the context and talk a little bit about the legal side. So Victor, maybe you can start us off with a question we often get, which is, okay, well, something's gone wrong on the cybersecurity side. what are the potential causes of action?
Sure. So I have to say that this is a very doom and gloom session. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking I'm very worried already. I'm going to add to it by basically very briefly outlining the various causes of action that could come up in this space. But first I want to say that even though we've been talking about third-party breaches and cybersecurity from that aspect, there is an internal angle to cybersecurity, and that includes your employee access, employee theft and employee error. And those are areas that can also cause a claim for cybersecurity. So within that, basically there are common law causes of action and statutory causes of action. So very briefly, on the common law front, obviously there are negligence actions, relatively high thresholds. I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but obviously there's got to be a duty of care, breach of duty, foreseeability of the loss, and proving the actual damages. The law evolves around factual matters that come up in day-to-day life, and there have been a number of specific tort actions that at least have been given a name within the court systems that have come into play. So the first one is called the tort of intrusion upon seclusion, which is really just invasion of privacy. An example of this is where one of your employees steals data from another employee. So it's more a person-to-person interaction. But it's going to come into play, and I'll explain that in a second. The second one is tort of public disclosure of private facts. I have to write this stuff down because they don't roll off your tongue. And then the simple one to explain this is revenge porn. So I send something to my wife, and it's a private communication, and she sort of posts it on the public, and that is the cause of action. The next one is called the tort of publicity given the private life. And this one is probably the most relevant for those in the room because they are related to sort of corporation faults. In the case of John Doe and Susie Jones against the Queen, this is where the people who participated in the medicinal marijuana program, which is a mail order system, so the government, in sending them the materials or whatever it is they were sending them, erroneously identified them on the outside of the envelopes as participants in this program. So, there has been a certified federal class action now where people are using this tort, among other ones, to claim for damages as a result of that. And this hasn't been successful yet, as far as I know, but for corporations, all of these are important because there have been attempts at roping in the company where an employee is at fault, either because they've stole something or they've been in error, through vicarious liability. It's tied to the negligence aspect, where basically the idea is that even though the company, didn't do anything, you should have supervised better, you should have had better policies or better protections to prevent one of your employees from having done something that caused me damage. So that's the common law side of things. There are also a bunch of statutory causes of action that could arise. One that is probably most relevant, but thankfully has not been successful yet, even in the States, as far as I know, are derivative actions. And this is just briefly where the company, a shareholder can sue the directors on behalf of the company for causing damages to the corporation. Then the individual privacy statutes also give rise to causes of action. So in BC, Manitoba, Newfoundland, and Saskatchewan, their privacy acts have created a statutory tort of invasion of privacy, where individuals can sue for breaches of privacy. And they don't have to prove damages. It's a statutory right. And it's not limited to specifically loss of personal information. An example of this happening is the Equifax breach recently. So the BC class action claims have included this as one of the claims. The PIPEDA, which also is not the anticipated regulations that will come into play, but the existing PIPEDA also does give rise to individual right to sue after the commissioner has either rendered its report or has decided to not take any further action. An individual does have the right at that point to bring an action in federal court for damages. Individual provincial statutes also come into play. I'm not going to go into all of them, but certainly most of the health information privacy statutes do give rise to statutory cause of action. Consumer protection legislation will also give rise to a cause of action, and an example of this being used is the Ashley Madison class action claim in Ontario. And finally, this is not enforced yet, thankfully. It was supposed to be in July, but under the anti-spam law, they have created a private cause of action for breaches of BPIDA as well. And lastly, which is the big thing, why is this all important? It's important because class action is a big thing now, and the more individual causes of action there are, the more people have the ability to at least go past the certification stage, because they don't have to meet individual tests of each of the individual claims. And just to give you a high-level summary of how many certified court actions there have been, even just in Canada, Home Depot, Sony Pictures, Target, People's Trust in BC recently, like I said, the marijuana case in the federal court action, Walmart's, and of course the ones that have been filed but haven't been certified would include Ashley Madison, Equifax, and I'm sure Uber soon. So that's my doom and gloom summary.
So clearly, from a legal perspective, there are grounds on which people can sue corporations for breaches. And exactly what you can allege obviously depends on the circumstances, but there were just two things in what Victor said that I thought it's worth highlighting. The first is some of these cause of actions have available to them statutory damages or damages for things that are usually difficult or impossible to prove. So for example, under PIPEDA, you can get damages for being essentially harassed or given a difficult time, even though from any normal, measurable commercial point of view, you'd have no damage. And the second is that because of the class action environment, you can take relatively small claims, dollar claims, that affect many people and stack them together and get a very large number of potential liability. And that's in Canada. In the United States, one of the additional aspects is that the regulators, for example, the Federal Trade Commission, can levy gigantic penalties as a regulatory matter. On top of that, we haven't yet seen that in Canada. The regulatory amounts that have been awarded have been relatively small. And of course, on top of all of that is not the legal side, it's the reputational damage, right? Nobody wants to be in Uber's situation as it was today when an announcement is made, they have not disclosed for the last year that there was a hack of millions of records and that they paid a ransom. So publicity, is a major factor in all this, even leaving aside the legal risks. So we've looked at what happens in the real world. We've looked at the legal aspect of this. So from a prophylactic point of view, the question comes up, well, what can we do about this? And I can tell you one of the questions I get reasonably often, interestingly enough, from general counsels who are being brought into board discussions at that level is, so what do we do as a strategy matter, which usually boils down to, I get a call saying, well, how much should we spend? The chief technology officer has given us a multi-million-dollar budget and says, give me a blank check. And management and the board says, well, but everybody says, give me a blank check, right? The marketing department wants that. The operation guys want that. In terms of trying to figure out from a prophylactic point of view how to balance resource needs, maybe, Jennifer, you can start us off with the insurance side of this.
Sure. So, when you're thinking about your cybersecurity strategy, what I would say is consider whether or not insurance can actually be integrated into that strategy. The tendency is to think of insurance as something that you look to once you've already had that loss. So my dishwasher has flooded my kitchen, I need to replace my floor, now I'm going to call my insurance company and get them to pay. But we are seeing cyber insurance products that are coming out that have really been designed differently, and they're designed to help organizations be proactive when they have any type of cyber incident. So you don't have to wait until you know that you've had 50,000 records compromised and you need to notify and you have a class action lawsuit. You can engage insurance prior to that as part of the overall cybersecurity approach to dealing with breaches. So a typical cyber liability insurance policy has really two key components to it. The first, we refer to it as first-party costs, but it's really just the costs an organization incurs to deal with a cyber breach. And the second being third-party liability. So when you actually do have litigation or regulatory proceedings that arise out of a cyber incident, if you need coverage for defense costs or damages or settlements or fines and penalties, that's the other side of that policy. The slide that you can see up is data from insurance companies that have actually made claims payouts under these policies, and you can see that the large majority, so 78% of those payouts, go towards just those crisis services, those first-party costs that an organization incurs just to deal with a breach, and a much lower percentage goes to deal with litigation and regulatory proceedings. So when you break down those, the claims data, if we can flip to the next slide, the claims data and the cost of these claims is really all over the place. But if you look at what the average cost of those crisis services, where we know most of the money goes, it's just over $350,000. So it's still not a small amount. So we are seeing companies engage with insurance in order to help them to facilitate getting the experts in and dealing with those costs. And there are four really key parts to that first party piece of the insurance policy. And the first being those breach response costs. So what insurance companies have realized is not every organization has the resources to go out on their own and retain experts and prepare on their own how to deal with one of these cyber incidents. So they have gone out and established panels of legal counsel and third-party service providers that in the event of a breach, an organization can call a 1-800 number, get put in touch with a breach coach, and at that point they will facilitate getting access to all of the vendors and legal counsel that are already on retainer. So that was used in that first example I discussed to really help that organization figure out very quickly, what do I do and who do I get involved? And the cost of that would then be covered under the policy. One of the second key coverages is the business interruption coverage. So again, a lot of these ransomware attacks can lead to at least a partial system shutdown and an interruption of your operations, which can mean lost revenue, extra expenses being incurred. So that's something else that the policy would cover under that first party bucket, where you have coverage for lost revenue, extra expenses to get back up and running, and even your ongoing expenses that you're incurring while your system is shut down. And then in addition to that, there's data restoration coverage, coverage to notify individuals if you get to that point or if you decide to offer credit or identity theft monitoring. So it really has become a tool that can be used to help give organizations turnkey access to all of the things that they will need to deal with a breach, and takes you as far as you sort of need to go, whether it be records are compromised and we need to notify, or that worst case scenario that Victor was discussing where now you're facing litigation or issues with the regulator. So I would say, I think Joseph's going to talk about the IT security piece, which is of course absolutely crucial, but when you're thinking about that overall cybersecurity spend, don't think about insurance as taking away that IT security money. It really, the hope would be you can integrate the two to work effectively together.
So I just want to turn for a second back to this slide for a minute. The idea that most of the money, and data from insurance company actually is a good proxy for this, I think, across the industry. The fact that a lot of the money is being spent on dealing with the breach as opposed to damages, for example, and litigation, it is quite significant for people who are inside companies, because in your role, from what I've seen as in-house counsel, one of the things that seems to get asked is, okay, we've had a breach, what can I expect? Who do I have to hire? And I can tell you that one of the early things that in-house counsel is often faced with is to figure out whether this is a big deal legally or whether this is something else, whether the spend, for example, is going to come from hiring people like Joseph, technology companies, hiring PR advisors, or in some cases, if somebody's gotten access to financial data, you need to deal with accountants, right, to figure out whether something's been touched, been altered, et cetera. My experience is about 80% of the time, it turns out that the legal aspect is the least important of all those factors. But of course, you don't know that at the beginning. And one of the things in-house counsel and their legal advisors on the outside do is really triage, right? What kind of problem is this? Is this really a reputational problem? Is it a legal problem? Do we have to report, as we're going to talk about, to somebody? Right? Am I facing a securities issue? All those kinds of things need to be measured right at the beginning. But a very large part of the time, the big part of the pie you see here is actually not going to deal with legal issues. It's going to deal with technology, PR, accounting, and so on. So turning now to the technology part, Joseph, if you had to choose from a prophylactic point of view, like one point you wanted to make to this group, what would it be?
My key piece that I always like to leave with is security training and the innate awareness of security within an organization. I think in today's environment, kind of with a lot of this happening, we're seeing the zone of penetration. If you look at this cartoon character, I think it's fantastic to kind of, the zone of penetration is so large, and as great as the systems now that we've developed to programmatically, systematically thwart those, we still have the human kind of element piece that is being taken advantage of to some extent. And so my thing is always make security part of the culture a little bit, like bring it in, have conversations about it, bring it at the board level, bring it to your vendors, to your suppliers, to your business partners, to other organizations, sister organizations, at reception, all the way through. And then you can look at key items, part of that training. I always ask this, and I get a lot of hands raised, how many of you use the same password across different websites? And a lot of people tend to raise their hands, and those are things that you really need to train users on, because the identity you may have personally outside of your corporate day-to-day work may be something that is taken advantage of to make you vulnerable within your day-to-day corporate life. And I think that, we call it the consumerization of IT, where the worlds of consumerization IT and business IT are blending so much that even the mobile phones we have on today are the same ones we check our email with, but we also have an account to buy other things, whether it's on purchasing sites or other music sites or things. So for me, it's really about the culture of security within your day, just like you have the culture of security at home. Do you lock the doors, you turn the alarm on, do you close the blinds, close the shades? It's that same movement, and I think as long as we do that, it makes you less attractive. And what you really want to be is less attractive to the assailants as an individual and as a corporation, and that's essentially the goal.
So a good example of this is last week I was speaking in Ottawa, not about this topic. I got the scintillating topic, internet jurisdiction. Who knew? People were excited. But the group that came after me was to talk about cybersecurity, and the audience was about half government people and regulators, all lawyers. And the fellow who talked about this had snuck into the conference on the first day and set up his own Wi-Fi hotspot with a very innocuous name. This was at the Shaw Conference Center in Ottawa. And the terms of use that everybody clicked on and hundreds of the attendees clicked on the second page of terms said, you agree that we can hack into all of your material and use it for any purpose we like, including stealing all your money. And lots of people said fine, and then went on to type in all kinds of personal information. And using that on stage, the guy was able to start hacking into people's cell phones who were in the audience, and their laptop computers and so forth. It was really quite incredible to see, because this was a pretty educated audience, right? That stuff goes on all the time, and it goes to show that when the technology people often talk about attack surfaces. The server is an attack surface. The communications is an attack surface. These things are attack surfaces, but people are too. Human beings are attack surfaces too, as we saw from that crying baby video at the beginning. But going back to sort of the prophylactic theme, the question for lawyers often is, well, what about on the governance side? You know, what are the different governance models that can help with improving cybersecurity at companies? Victor, you want to chime in on that one?
Sure. I mean, we are now at a point where I think everybody understands, certainly in-house counsel, outside counsel, that cybersecurity is an enterprise level risk. It's not an IT risk. It's not an HR risk. It's an enterprise level risk. So, you know, once you get to that point, then it becomes, and I think you guys can probably tell me, but I suspect many of you are involved internally with senior management, board of directors, consideration of cybersecurity. And if you're not, you need to be, and certainly the board needs to be engaged. One, you know, we talked about earlier the various tort claims or statutory claims that could come, including derivative action. One of the defense for derivative action is obviously, as a director, you've exercised your duty, you've discharged your fiduciary duty, and to show that, in the cases in the states that have had these claims and where the claim has been defeated, it has been shown, the evidence have shown that the board met regularly to talk about the internal cybersecurity issues and assessed the risk, had received reports from management. So that's very important. But just more generally, I think, you know, people try to like use buzzwords like you see on the slide that are there. So, you know, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. You know, basically what this means is internally you got to figure out, you know, what are your key risk areas, and that goes to both the nature of the data you have. Either is it secure data for your employees, personal data from your customers, but it could also be the fact that you have third-party engagements with somebody who has a secure data, but you have access to that system. Like that is also a risk because you could be backdoored into someone else's materials where even though they don't care about you, they just want to get access through you. Once you understand, identify all the risks, then you got to prioritize and come up with a plan that fits with your needs. Because obviously, as we've heard so far, even between insurance and IT protections, you're not going to get everything. So you got to figure out what is most important to you, what is most important to other people when they look at the access of information that they have through you. You got to come up with a plan. You got to come up with a plan where you as a senior management, as the board, are managing the implementation of the plan, but also making sure there's periodic assessment of the plan, where somebody's actually going to see whether or not the plan is working out. And having policies, having training of your HR. Again, making sure that, for example, if somebody is going to download something on a USB, that the policy is clear that it's got to be encrypted, you can't leave it at a bar, et cetera, et cetera. Having a plan to deal with breaches in terms of a recovery and responding. Do we call Peter or Ruby right away? Do we call Joseph right away? Do we call Jen right away? Those are things that you need to have thought about in advance, because by the time it happens, as Peter showed earlier, you have 36 hours over a long weekend to deal with this, or otherwise it's way too late. I'm not going to go through all the different things, but on the security side of things, people have the CSA have, obviously focused on this issue as well. They come up with a policy, a notice, where they've identified a lot of the same things in terms of what a company should be doing. And even if you're not a public company, I think those are good guidance for things that you should be doing. Again, training, having a plan, due diligencing your third-party relationships. Making sure not just from a financial perspective now, it's IT diligence. What kind of policies do they have? What kind of training have they done? Because once you integrate a third party in, now that's part of your problem. So you got to deal with that in advance. Interestingly, the CSA notice also talks about insurance being one key component of the defense. So talk to Jen afterwards.
So we're going to talk about breach notification in a minute, but if you'll forgive me, there's one diversion I want to make now for a second, which is to talk about Europe's GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. How many of you have heard of this? All right, so I'm on the board of the International Technology Law Association. I can tell you worldwide, in the IT space, it is the only thing anybody is going to talk about. And I thought we'd just summarize it for you, for those of you who haven't had a chance to get into it in depth. But before we do that, Dan, you're the general counsel of the Canadian operation of a gigantic worldwide IT company. Can you tell us why anybody in this room should care about Europe's GDPR?
Sure, I can. This is not going to help us yet, but maybe your next slide's better, and then we'll come back to that one. But so I work for SAP. It's a German international software company based out of Europe. And not only are we concerned about that because we're a European company, but I'm concerned about it because as the Canadian subsidiary of a European company, we have obligations as Canadians because of the extraterritorial application of this legislation. Much like Counsel, and you saw everybody, every 2 years the flavor of a topic comes and goes, and I remember being in this room probably, or any other number of seminar rooms around the city and talking about Counsel, and that was a very exciting topic for 2 years, and the extraterritorial effect of that legislation to US and other companies around the world created phone calls for me from all over the world saying, what's going on in Canada and why do they think there's an extraterritorial aspect to that legislation? Similarly with GDPR, the breadth of that legislation and the obligations that it places on companies around the world when they're interacting with European data subjects is going to affect every Canadian company, most likely, unless they put procedures and processes in place to somehow protect them from this extraterritorial application of the legislation. Now, this slide, which I'm not going to go through in depth because it's too small writing for me to see here, we go through not as a selling company, like we license software and provide cloud services and do all kinds of data hosting, and we have obligations to our customers as a data processor. But recently, as the general counsel for the Canadian company, I've become increasingly aware of our obligations as a data controller under this legislation. And so we've gone to our suppliers and analyzed every supplier as it fits into our use of their services and analyze whether there's an application of whether we're responsible or we're covered or have obligations under GDPR. I go through this little flow chart as a beginning process generally to determine whether the interaction with these processes and services would bring light to the extraterritorial implications of GDPR. And so, for example, cell phone services is something that we've just gone through. We've looked at our suppliers in that area, and then we've had to take organizational measures to try to limit the effects of GDPR in relation to suppliers that can or cannot or will not meet the obligations that we're going to be required to, in the spring, to comply with as we relate to these European data subjects. I'm not sure if that's...
No, that's great. GDPR, for those of you who don't know, is due to come into effect May next year. And I'm not going to explain the whole regulation. It's complicated. My European friends tell me that nobody really understands entirely what it means yet. They're waiting to see what happens to Google and Facebook and others, as they're probably the first ones through the regulatory system. It's Europe, so it has to be implemented in all the European countries. It's a regulation, so it's actually part of the law, not just a guideline. But I did want to highlight a few things for you. And the headline one is that under this regulation, fines can be leveled against companies up to a maximum of 20 million euros or 4% of a business's worldwide turnover. So big fines, right, potentially. There's a mandatory breach notification law that says 72 hours, not, by the way, like Uber, a year, 72 hours, where feasible. I mean, there's some exceptions in the regulation. And there are some aspects for low-risk environments or where there's no personal data involved. Dan mentioned processors and controllers for a minute. In a nutshell, the controllers are the organizations who the data belongs to, and the processors are the ones, an example would be Visa, for example, that process data for others. Historically, liability attached to the controllers, who would then pass on responsibility through contract to the processors. Now under GDPR, processors actually are going to have statutory obligations, including security obligations, obligations to follow certain instructions of the controllers that give them data, and to notify controllers when there's a security incident. And of course, for the first time, processors will be exposed to financial liability under the law directly to the people affected. And that's for the first time in Europe. And if you think about it from the point of view of who's going to be sued, as a litigator, we all, those of us who've done this, know that you sue everybody and you look for the deepest pocket. Well, now there's a whole other range of everybody's to look at. There's also going to be a set, and this is important for Canadians, a tighter set of rules on international transfers of data, which may affect you if you're dealing in Europeans' data. And as well, a greater transparency is going to be required around data processing. So you're going to have to tell the affected individuals or company more about what you're doing with their data, what you have, where it's being transferred, and so on. Also, data protection impact assessments are going to become mandatory. And there are probably two aspects of this. The first is they're costly. You need to go hire consultants to do this work for you, generally speaking. And on the other side is if you're dealing, it turns out, in high-risk data or high-risk situations, then the local data protection authority in Europe actually has the power to stop you from doing that high-risk thing if they're not satisfied that you've taken appropriate risk mitigation measures. So that's sort of a summary of GDPR at a high level. And really our only message on this point is it may apply to your organizations. And if it does, you should care and start thinking about how you're going to deal with that regulatory risk, which, by the way, may not be primary risk. It could be passed down to you as a processor or through contract by the people that you do business with. But let's go back to Canada for a minute. And before we go too much further with this, we've just talked about, between all of us, all kinds of prophylactic things to do to try and improve your security posture. Maybe Joe, we'll start with you. If we do all the things that we talked about, will you achieve fulsome security? Can we feel safe?
Magic question. I have yet to, some of the breaches that our organization has helped negotiate and deal with, those customers have done a lot to secure their environments and to really some of them have done a lot to secure their environments and be ready. And I think doing that work has limited the exposure and made things less damaging. And then some of the customers I meet think that they've done a lot, but then they really haven't. And then you kind of get in there and they want to know how bad it is. And you're like, it's really bad. And how could it be bad? They told me it was really good and everything was safe. And well, I don't know what they were telling you, but that's not really the situation. So I think that how much have you done really is about your risk profile and how much risk you have across your organization. I showed earlier some basic things I think you need to be doing and everyone needs to be doing. But as systems become more complex, as the surface of attack grows, I think it's going to be even a bigger steep hurdle for us to climb. And it's still one of the things I'm finding so uniquely interesting. I'll just derail and say one last little piece item here. We had an organization that we worked with. They must have done about 90 to 95% of the security best practice measures. But they had a huge ransom encryption that encrypted all their file servers, locked them down for days, nobody could work. And we find out that the reason that was penetrated was because the one user, which was a VP of the organization, kept complaining to IT so much because every time he would travel and update his browser, update an app, it would ask for elevated credentials, which is basically IT needs to type in your username and password for you to install something. Screaming, yelling, I'm not happy about this, your help desk doesn't know what they're doing. So they gave up and gave him local administrative privileges on his computer, which allows him to do anything that he wants to do on that computer. And essentially, so you're looking at such a small entry point. He actually clicked on a piece of ransomware, just like he installs everything else, click, 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 click. It installed, he was traveling, he came back, it connected to the environment, and it froze and encrypted about 27 servers, and that took weeks and days to resolve. And so, you can be doing a lot, but you miss one, and there's your challenge. So yes, I do think you could shrink the zone, but you also need to be aware that it's never gone.
So we haven't heard this in Canada, but in the US, the leading government authorities in this area say it's not whether you're going to be hacked. You've been hacked. The only question is, have you noticed yet?
That's right.
Right, and whether there have been any consequences, because as Joseph said earlier, a lot of the time they don't find anything valuable and they just move on. So, Jennifer, with that in mind, that we have exposure, can you just for a minute talk about how insurance sort of fills that risk gap?
Absolutely. So I think because of exactly what Joe just said, where you can use IT security to reduce your risk, but it may never fully be gone, we are seeing the cyber insurance market continue to grow and these risk mitigation measures continue to be used. And they're really being used as in a security strategy because very few companies have an unlimited IT budget. So they can't just spend whatever they want on IT security, but they want to try and continue to have some type of financial control over those potential losses that could arise from a cyber incident. And we're also seeing them use insurance in terms of, okay, well, we would prefer to purchase this technology to protect this data, but the technology is cost prohibitive to our company. So maybe what we will do is do the best we can and insure that potential loss, or recognize they cannot insure a potential loss, and so focus their data spend on what they cannot insure. So we really are seeing them work hand in hand in terms of using that IT and then mitigating remaining risk through insurance. The good news is that because this is such a growing market, we are continuing to see more insurers enter the market. So there's increasing capacity, which has actually brought down the price of insurance across the board for the last few years. And even though we continue to read about these massive data breaches, we aren't really seeing insurance increase incrementally. In fact, the price is probably stalled at this point. The exception being certain industries where if you are in the retail industry or you are a healthcare service provider, your risk profile is going to be very different from the sort of standard insurance buyer. And in that case, we've seen higher premiums come in to cover the fact that those losses have been really significant. When we're asked, our brokers are asked, well, what impacts the cost of my insurance? Do insurers care if I have spent a lot of money on my IT security or not, or if I've worked with an expert to do penetration testing and understand my exposure? Absolutely, they definitely do care. You cannot call an insurance company and say, we bought Norton antivirus, we're good to go. You are not going to get an insurance policy. But that's not going to be the only factor to that cost. Where your organization is located and the size of your organization will come into play. The type of data that you have in your care, custody, or control, the limits that you're looking to purchase, and as they will ask you questions like, do you have a culture of security at your organization? That will be a question that you will likely see when you're looking to purchase insurance. So it really is key to have the two work together, but the cost of insurance, I would say, has come down, so it's no longer really a cost prohibitive product for many companies.
Terrific. So I promised we'd talk about breach notification. Victor, do you want to lead us through, in summary, sort of what are the Canadian requirements?
Sure. I mean, the requirement for notice right now, other than if you're subject to the Alberta legislation, is to notify the privacy commissioner, either if you're subject to the federal one or your provincial one. In Alberta, there is also an obligation, if deemed necessary by the privacy commissioner there, to notify individuals. If you're subject to the health privacy legislation, in often cases those also come with obligations to notify the individuals that are subject to the breach. In Ontario, if you're subject to the Ontario personal health information, there is an obligation to notify the relevant college. Now, the new regulations that are coming out under PIPEDA is going to significantly expand this. In particular, it's going to have an obligation to notify individuals. And I think the test is, in terms of the timing, is as feasible as possible, whatever that may mean. The new PIPEDA regulations will also impose a requirement to keep a record of every single breach of your system. And this is not a breach that becomes notifiable in any way, but every single breach. And then Peter will tell you why that is important from his perspective as a litigator as well. And then, so that's the notification requirement. If you're a public company, obviously you're subject to disclosure requirements as well. So it's not just individual breaches per se. If you've been hacked a number of times, each time with relatively immaterial impact, the fact that you've been hacked a million times or multiple times may itself be a disclosable fact. So, and then lastly, have to be aware of your third-party obligations in terms of contractual notification. Sometimes it could be as simple as the fact that you have a compliance with law obligation, and the failure to do something, it's itself a notifiable offense under a contract, and that could have, adverse consequences. Especially in something like a lending facility or something material that may have cross default provisions relating to everything else. So a little minor thing could lead to a big whack of issues.
So can we just pause for a minute on the, not notification, but the record keeping obligation that's been enacted in PIPEDA but is not yet in force? Because that's important. How many of you work with companies who have some kind of operation in the United States, that do business there in any way, right? So, okay, so fair number. So this is the way it works with class action litigation in the United States. Let's say you have a data breach there. So a class action is started, you're accused of negligence, not meeting the standard of care, and what happens? They say, oh, you've got either a head office or a branch in Canada, where we know you have a record-keeping obligation to keep records of all the breaches you didn't report. And maybe you didn't have to report them. But now we can, on discovery in the United States, ask for that information, knowing those records must exist because it's required under the law. And now the plaintiff's class action lawyers have two things. One, they have a roadmap to how you deal with breaches. And second, when you say, how could we have known we were going to be hacked in the US, they would say, you've had 8 security incidents. You had ample notice, and so the standard of care is actually elevated for you. So one thing to think about is complying when it comes into force with the Canadian law can actually put you at risk in the United States. And the same as it works for Canada, but our class action bar isn't quite as vociferous quite yet. So those are things you can think about balancing. We're coming to the end of our presentation, and we are going to take questions. So if you want to start thinking about them, this would be a good time to do so. But before we get to that, I just want to very briefly touch on security incident response plans. That is something we talked about before without naming it, but this idea of getting ready with a written plan in case you have a breach. So I have to tell you, from my point of view of somebody who only gets called after the breach, sometimes my clients have these plans, sometimes they don't. We have never used one. It usually goes out the window in the first 3 minutes. Its value at the moment of a breach largely is there's usually a list of who's on the team. So you don't have to waste a lot of time figuring out who's the key IT person, who's the key person in marketing, who's the key executive, et cetera. But the plan, which is often several pages long, we never use it. That said, Victor, maybe we can start with you. Does it have value for other purposes other than just the breach itself?
Yes, it does. First, you should have a plan, and you should hopefully have one that you've tested and evolved along the way, that so someday you actually will use it. But having said that, it does help on the due diligence defense, right? It's part of your diligence in responding to the risk that applies to your company, and having a plan to deal with it is part of that, part of the discharge of your duties as, you know, a senior officer or director of the company, in terms of making sure that you have tried to think about the things that apply. Now, whether or not you use it or not, there are reasons for that, but you should definitely have one.
Okay. So we have a lot to talk about, but so that we leave time for questions, I want to make sure we cover at least one thing, which comes up relatively often. Now, we heard from Joseph of something called ransomware attacks. The idea is that the assailant does something to your company. It can be various things, including locking you out of your own data or system, and they say, pay me. And so one of the questions we get asked as lawyers all the time is, you know, to paraphrase Shakespeare, to pay or not to pay, right? And I don't know, I won't ask if people have been asked that question. That might be a loaded thing to volunteer. But particularly for encryption attacks or theft of data, maybe Victor, I can ask you to start, and we'll come back and ask you, Joseph, for your experience as well. But can you talk a little bit about paying?
Well, it's not a legal answer per se, but it's certainly from what we've seen, I think it does often make sense to pay. There are two reasons for this. One, there seems to have been, and Joseph will probably have a better sense of this, I think what we call honor among thieves. Like they once you pay, they have in fact come through and either release your materials or you know, given you the code to unlock your encrypted system. And oftentimes, relatively speaking, it's a relatively modest sum that they ask for, because, you know, I think their business model is to go after 1 million of them, and 500,000 of them pay everybody $10,000. That's a lot of money. Not to steal, I think someone's going to talk about Uber, but Uber, like, they paid $100,000. Like, it only came out today because they actually got the data back, right? Like from 57 million records a year ago. So, you know, I think from my perspective, yes, it makes sense to pay, and generally you should pay. Sorry, I want to say one more thing. And if you don't pay and something bad happens, right, then if this comes out that you could have paid and you could have prevented all of this stuff from happening, you know, that could potentially be a claim in itself, that you actually didn't exercise your duty to protect the data by paying in the first place when it was only X amount, preventing from the breach from happening in the first place.
So let me add a word about this, because I get asked this question all the time, and usually what happens is somebody in senior management or the board says, we don't negotiate with terrorists, right? And there's usually somebody else who says, the police tell you if you're mugged, hand over your wallet, right? So there are these two points of view. My own answer when I'm asked is that it's entirely contextual, but for sure you should think about paying. It shouldn't be off the table. And sometimes the answer is, for various reasons, don't pay. But sometimes it is that you should, and you know, you do it with distaste and a great deal of problems. The other question we often get asked is it illegal to pay? And so I'll often get calls from in-house counsel and that's oddly enough, the first question. Somebody's hacked us. Can I pay? And the short answer is yes, with one exception. If you have any reason to believe that you'd be funding terrorism by paying, then you can't do it under Canadian law. Dan says you have to withhold for tax purposes. I'm not sure how you do that with Bitcoin, but anyways. But Joe, can you give us your insight on this?
So absolutely. So it's all contextual. There's a lot of hackers out there that probably know more about me than I would like to probably to know or be comfortable with, because when we're brought into a scenario, what we tend to do is split the teams. We will have one individual or two negotiating with the group or the assailant, and then we have the internal IT and the internal organization working with kind of a response team to close all the holes. What tends to happen, one of the reasons that people end up paying is, and one of the things we've done in the past, which has been somewhat successful, I know Peter, you and I have talked about this, is we send them a contract and we say, here's a if the impetus is to pay and the it's not very obvious how they got in. There's no huge gaping holes, and everyone's going to spend hundreds and hundreds and thousands of hours of trying to close them and really figure out what happened. And they have data, and sometimes it's fantastic. They YouTube the data. They YouTube it, and then they send you a link and prove that they have the data. So they're really good at setting this thing up perfectly. And so we try and say, okay, why don't you sign a contract saying that you've provided a wonderful security service on behalf of the customer, and in return for X lump payments over the next couple of days or whatever, you'll put the data in this secure zone that we're going to provide you. You won't have access to it, and in return we'll give you the funds. So I think the key is to really separate the groups, and I believe it really helps keep. Yeah, one of the things that I don't want to take up too much time on this, but one of the things which really surprises me, and I think surprises a lot of people, is these assailants or these groups really have nothing to do. They are just sitting there waiting for you. So you'll be getting messages at 1 in the morning, 4 in the morning, 7 in the morning. You don't know their time zone. A lot of the times they use what I call disposable chat. So as they're talking, it's vanishing. So it's not like they're sending you an email. This isn't like, oh, I'll send you an email with traces. They use these encrypted chats. So it's a very different way of speaking with them. And all they really want is they essentially want the money and to move on with their lives. And then they start reading you the riot act, how this client is very unreasonable and irresponsible. They don't know what they're doing. So you got to kind of be patient. But I think separating the groups is really critical to figuring out whether or not you should and shouldn't pay, how you negotiate, because it keeps you calm and relaxed and allows you to kind of essentially work with someone that usually sometimes has something that's very critical to that client.
One of my favorite ones that Joseph and I worked on together is the hacker sent us a contract that was backdated to before the hack.
That was great.
And said,
brilliant,
you're hiring us to do the hack.
Brilliant.
And then report to you how we did it so that you can close your vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, it's not worth the paper it's written on, but I thought that was very clever.
Fantastic.
And it was written in sort of pseudo-legalese, like if you were watching, Law and Order or LA Law or something, and you could probably type that up yourself, and it would look not bad in a page-long agreement. Last word to you on this point, Jennifer. Do insurance companies pay for the ransom?
Yes, so cyber extortion is a claim under an insurance policy. And just to quickly add to what Joseph said, I think we've seen situations where if you decide to pay. We had a client who tried to negotiate by saying, we only want the encryption codes for these 5 systems. How much will that cost us? And the assailant said, well, no, it's a flat rate for everything. And sure enough, they paid, they got the encryption code, and then the assailant said, okay, so that was the cost for everything else. How much do you want to pay for the encryption code for those 5 systems? So don't give them that kind of information. So if you decide to pay, pay. Use Joseph to negotiate on your behalf. Don't do it on your own.
Right. Joseph's got great stories about how to negotiate with hackers and how to pay them. Like how do you actually do this?
My tradespeople teach me how to do that really well. It's great.
Okay, right, exactly. Okay, so we've got a little bit of time for questions. Does anybody have anything they want to ask? We have a microphone here, so Sandra, if you can help us.
It's tough for me.
This one's for Jennifer. When you're looking at social engineering fraud protection, are you finding that more under cyber policies, or would that be under like a fidelity bond crime cover?
Great question, because a lot of times it doesn't make sense to the layperson, but in the insurance industry, they do make a distinction between a loss of money that you voluntarily transfer to a fraudulent actor versus a cyber hack where they actually hack into your system. We are seeing a change in the cyber insurance, so it really depends now on the policy you're buying. Social engineering, it's not covered under your crime policy unless you actually buy an endorsement for that policy to cover it. But we are seeing cyber insurance policies now that come out with social engineering coverage, because that's a distinction that maybe it makes sense to those in the insurance industry, but to the layperson, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So that's a really good question to ask a broker. Social engineering, am I covered, and am I covered under crime or cyber or both?
There was another question on the left here.
Can the insurance policy require you to pay the ransom and cancel the rest of your insurance to mitigate the losses to the insurance company? If you're in a position where you cannot pay the ransom for maybe various reasons of the type and nature of entity you are?
So the insurance company should only be able to cancel your insurance policy if it's a well-drafted policy for non-payment of premium. So that whether or not you pay the ransom really shouldn't come into play, but whether or not you have insurance going forward. They may choose not to renew your policy if they feel that the risk is not one they want to underwrite. But in terms of whether or not they're going to force you to pay the ransom, my experience has always been that they are going to defer to the expert opinion, and really the whole goal is to get you back up and running. And so if that means paying the ransom, that means paying the ransom. And if you could do it without paying the ransom, then that would be the decision that's made. So the insurance company wouldn't be the one making the decision. They would defer to the experts about how that would play out.
And what if you disagree? It's not about getting up and running. You just can't pay the ransom. It's against company policy.
Oh, it's your company's policy. So again, that would probably be a discussion, because if you have experts advising you pay the ransom and your company's saying it's our policy not to, then you'd probably have a discussion. But at the end of the day, you'd have access to your insurance proceeds to try and remedy the problem until you ran out of that insurance policy limit.
Other questions? All right. Dan is going to close for us in a moment. But let me just say, first of all, thank you for joining us at Goodman's. We appreciate it. This has been a lot of fun. As you've probably noticed, our own approach to cyber issues is actually not entirely legal. We've spent most of our time actually talking about the non-legal aspects, because they're at least as important, and in this area sometimes more important. But whether it's Victor and I, or anybody up here, or you, it's very hard to give people advice if you don't understand the environment, and that's what we've tried to share with you. We do these programs on a regular basis on all kinds of topics, so if you'd want to be on our Counsel compliant mailing list, feel free to drop your card off at the desk where you picked up your badges, and we're happy to include you and let you know when these kinds of things are happening. Dan, do you want to?
Yeah, so thanks, Peter and Goodman's, for having us here today at the ACC. I want to remind everybody that last night they got approval for 1.5 hours of professionalism. And if you don't need the professionalism, which I assume everybody does, because that's the one that's hard to get at the end of the year, it will roll over into substantive. Additionally, there are forms to fill out for questionnaires feedback forms on your table. We'd appreciate it. The ACC would appreciate it, so we can tailor better and more topical discussion moving forward with all of our presentations. We'd like to thank, this is Goodman's first foray into sponsorship with the ACC. We hope we continue the relationship, and I really appreciate all of Peter's work for me personally that he does for SAP, and putting on the seminar for the rest of the in-house counsel.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you.